Our first panellist this morning is Tim Hollo, Executive Director of the Green Institute, an environmentalist, musician and political strategist. Tim has worked for the Greens, Greenpeace and others, as well as performing around the world. Tim is also founder and Executive Director of Green Music Australia and has written for a wide range of publications. Tim's running as the Greens candidate for the newly created seat of Canberra in the upcoming federal election, and we wish him every success in his election bid. So Tim, I'll hand over to you for 7 minutes. Are you okay with that little mic? Yeah. Well, you can have his hand.
Hopefully.
Okay. Please join me in welcoming Tim.
Thank you. Can you hear me like that?
Yep.
Yes, sounds like it. Good. I also acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, as well as to their system of governance, which we can learn so much from. One of the things which capitalism, like any hegemonic system, does is to arrange the world in our minds in its image. Capitalism, being an economic system, frames the organising principles of human society as economic. Everything is, in one way or another, about the production, consumption or exchange of goods and services. Conscious of Michelle's important explanation yesterday, what I want to do here at the new Economy Network conference is to challenge us to step outside economic frames and talk about what we're doing, following on from that fantastic introduction from Sam, as a political project. Because it's politics which is the process through which we come together to make decisions communally about our common future. This is not, of course, to reject economic questions. Economic questions are central to politics, but politics goes beyond that. Capitalism, of course, presents politics and democracy itself in terms of market exchange. It presents the market as a democratic system. Increasingly, it says that there's no need to go to the trouble of holding votes when consumers vote with their dollars. The kind of post-capitalist system that we talk about at these conferences, a system based on principles of the commons, caring for the community and the natural world for the long term, has to replace this frame. We have to see the commons as political, and we have to see politics as a commons in order to build a politics of and for the commons. Let's unpack this a little. Seeing the commons as political is how we shift commons practices from being different, non-capitalist, to being transformative, post-capitalist. It's entirely possible, of course, for cooperative, regenerative economic practices to exist on the margins of capitalist economic practices. They've always been there. And until we see the commons as a political project, that's where they'll remain, at the margins. If we want to transform the system, we have to see our non-capitalist acts as political acts, as deliberately disruptive of the current system, as prefiguring a new way of being in the world. What about seeing politics as a commons? David Bollier describes the commons as a resource plus a community plus a set of social protocols. We're used to applying this to a field or the atmosphere, even cities now. I suggest that we need to view democracy as a common pool resource, which we, the community, must steward through political protocols. Democracy can be strip-mined for the benefit of those in power, or it can be cultivated to grow public goods, trust and social cohesion. Democracy can be enclosed to exclude the many for the profit of the few. Corporate political donations, access of lobbyists, shutting down civil society, attacking unions, criminalising protest, investor-state dispute resolution, privatisation of public services, all of these damage the integrity and sustainability of our democracy, undermining its capacity to grow public goods. Following Ostrom's 8 rules, we can define democracy as a common pool resource to be managed in common. We can identify us all as the community taking control of democracy for our shared benefit. We can commit to collectively and democratically managing democracy through norms and institutions and laws. We can effectively monitor the management of democracy through transparent governance, strong and diverse public interest media and civil society, commissions against corruption and more. We can ensure compliance through clear, democratically developed and implemented sanctions for anti-democratic behaviour. We can guarantee open and accessible conflict resolution through access to courts, parliaments, decision-making bodies at all levels, as well as introducing more participatory modes of governance. And we can build nested, layered, polycentric models of governance, stewarding democracy through democratic practice from the local to the global level. Those of you who know Austrian well will note that I skipped Rule 7 because it's about the interaction of those outside the resource with those inside, and democracy is fundamentally universal if it's to work at all. So how do we get there? Guided by Ostrom, Bollier, Foster, Ione and Bookchin and others, I identify 5 basic design principles for creating a politics of the commons, which I want to very briefly outline in the little time remaining. Number 1, we have to fully enfranchise ourselves. We have to make our commoning acts political acts and invite others to join on that basis. We have to embed participatory, deliberative, collaborative democratic processes at every level, from local to global, in geographic regions, in interest groups, in workplaces, in communities, connecting people with politics and governance in order to rebuild respect and care for democracy. Number 2, we have to institutionalise stewardship. We need to use those democratic processes to ensure that they are built on understanding that we are stewards for each other, for democracy itself, for all other beings, and for future generations. And we do that through shifting cultural norms, through our actions, through driving and demanding constitutional reform, bills of rights, rights of nature. Number 3, we have to deinstitutionalise selfishness. We need to stop rewarding self-interested and free-riding behaviour, most particularly by redefining and re-regulating corporations to make profit secondary to social and environmental responsibilities. Number 4, we have to embrace complexity and interconnection. We need to replace linear, simplistic political solutions to individual problems with systemic approaches that recognise a plurality of issues, causes and solutions. And we do that primarily, I believe, by involving more people all the time, respectfully in the conversations, leading them to engage with the complexity. And finally, we need to actually reclaim the commons. We need to stop enclosing commons and begin to reclaim public space, real, virtual and abstract public space, which has been enclosed. That's just a thumbnail sketch. But in that way, I believe we can build a politics of solidarity, pluralism, ecology and equity, in which the mutual interconnection of diverse parts increases the resilience and sustainability of the whole. A post-capitalist politics of the commons.
Thank you so much, Tim. Jose, would you like a... Yeah, you happy with that lapel mic?
Yeah, I'll use that.
Great.
Thanks.
So our next panellist this morning is Dr. Jose Ramos, Director of Action Foresight, a Melbourne-based business that focuses on supporting vision-driven experimentation. He's taught Foresight, Public Policy and Social Innovation at a number of universities, including at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Swinburne, Victoria Uni and University of the Sunshine Coast. He's Senior Consulting Editor for the Journal of Future Studies, a researcher with the Pew-to-Pew Foundation, one of my best mates. Known each other for a long time, has about 20 years. And has over 50 publications spanning economic, cultural and political change. Why don't you work a bit harder, Jose? Over to Jose. Please welcome Jose.
Yeah. It's good to be here among friends, and I've been doing a lot of therapy this whole time, so thanks to all the people who are helping with that. Okay, so the first thing is we have to look at capitalism historically. People like historians like Emanuel Wallerstein, William Robinson, Leslie Scalaire. They basically show how capitalism's emergence was tied intimately to empire, conquest, dispossession, from the mercantile phase to the industrial phase, and to this now information phase. So I think we have to look at the broad scope of historical change, and when you look that way, you see different strategies of extraction. So if you look deeply into history, first modes of extraction were conquest and dispossession. Next modes of extraction during industrialization were through the use of new emerging industrial technologies, and the resources that indigenous people held under their feet. And then the kind of extraction that we're seeing, especially the way William Robinson talks about it, is capitalism has moved from extensive capitalism, going outward and extracting, towards intensive capitalism, which is the colonization of the life world, the colonization of the imagination. This is what you're talking about, Tim, and what Sam's also talking about. So I think we have to look historically. When we take a broad historical view, we can also see that we are at the point of civilizational overshoot and collapse. So this system that was developed is now at the point of extracting well beyond what we're able to extract. It's worked for a certain amount of people to the exclusion of many other people, and now it's not working for anyone. So with that in mind, the way that I see a post-capitalist imaginary, a post-capitalist world, is through a couple of different ideas. The first is that commons are implicit, and they become explicit through a phase shift. So for example, if you go back 70 years, the atmosphere was an implicit commons. Yes, we all need a safe climate. We all want to live in a Holocene in which the climate is stable and we can grow our food, where we can not die of overheating. But that's moved now from an explicit common. So the climate is now an explicit commons that we all have to protect, that we all have to govern. And so this movement from implicit to explicit is for anything that we depend on for our mutual well-being and survival. That's how I partly define the commons. What we depend on for our mutual well-being and survival. The climate has now become that. That phase shift implicates us into the need for governance. And so this then connects to what you're talking about, Tim. When we become implicated into something that's our very survival, then we must step up and say, we must govern this. We must actually transform this situation. And that implies a radical democratization of the way that our world works. So when we think about commons, and commons are very diverse, because we can see we're implicated when we think about what we depend on for our survival and well-being. We depend on a functioning health system. We depend on safety on our streets. We depend on a democracy that is truly responsive. We depend on an atmosphere. We depend on an urban commons that truly nurtures us and that we can nurture. So there's multiple commons that we're implicated in. When we think that way, what do we depend on? What do we mutually depend on for our survival and well-being? So that leads to the idea of an ecology of the commons. So essentially, the conceptual movement here is that there's actually a whole number of different spaces in which we are implicated in the need to govern for our mutual well-being. And so what that implies is, how do we create the structural synergies of power between these different spaces, these different nodes of power, in ways in which we can actually form concrete changes. So to give a slightly more concrete example, Michelle Ballins likes to talk about the idea of the partner state. Partner state is a state/bureaucratic system that is going to be supportive of commoning efforts. Right? So that's an example of an ecology of the commons and a structural synergy of power between one sphere and another. We need to treat democracy as a commons, and we need to pair that democratic commoning with the grassroots commoning that many people are talking about. And also, how does that link up to a global design commons? You know, global knowledge that's going to sustain us. So there's these ecosystem relationships in this commoning process that we have to attend to, understand, and then form the sinews between. And so that leads to one last idea, which is the protocol commons. The protocol commons, drawing from the metaphor, I don't know if it's a metaphor, but the example of Tim Berners-Lee's invention of the internet, the hypertext transfer protocol, HTTP, was the invention that allowed all of these different websites to talk to each other. And so what we actually need to build in terms of a strategic step forward is a protocol commons. How do all of these different spaces, democracy, the digital commons, the urban commons, accounting commons, and all these different places, how do they actually talk to each other to create structural synergies of power so that it's not just these separate things, but actually we have coherence and we're moving and building that alternative political economy, political social order, and that new cultural world. Thank you.
While Amanda gets set up with the mic, I'll just say thank you so much, Jose, and welcome and introduce Amanda as our next panelist. So Amanda is the CEO of the Next Economy, Dr. Amanda Cahill, I should say. Amanda, welcome. And founding steering group member of NENA. For over 2 decades, she's worked with communities across Australia and the world to develop more equitable and sustainable local economies, of late with coal and gas-affected communities in Australia. So please join me in welcoming Amanda. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Is this working?
Yeah.
Better? Sorry. That's better. Great. I'm going to change tack just a little bit because what I do is work at the grassroots level, and I want to talk about how do we bring these big concepts, and there's some really great starting points for process and what we're hearing, but what does that actually look like on the ground? How does this actually play out in everyday politics? Because this is about power, and I'm loving it that yesterday and today that's what we're talking about. We've got so many solutions out there. People in this room are out there building the alternatives. That was point number 3, I think, on Sam's talk. But how do we build the sinews? Where does the change happen? Where are the connection points? So I'm going to start with a really concrete example that happened a few weeks ago. I was attending the Australian Regional Development Conference. Now that's a sort of peak conference for local governments in Australia. So a lot of local government people, urban planners, people and doing things on the ground. And to tell you the truth, I kind of wasn't very excited about this conference. I knew it was a very conservative group of people, and I thought it was going to be a lot of project-based stuff. It was the same old, same old. And I was pleasantly surprised. There are people all over Australia at that local level who are dealing with challenges, and they're coming up with really interesting solutions. They don't talk about post-capitalism. They don't even talk about sustainability. It took 2 days for anyone to mention climate change. But they've been building large-scale renewable energy projects, really interesting waste projects and programs, and actually integrating that into different kinds of systems. They're dealing with empty shops. They're starting to deal with inequality. And the fact that government services have been pulled out of a lot of places, they're having to get creative about addressing issues around equity. So I got really excited. I'm like, wow, this is really cool. And I know this because I go and work in regional communities. So I know there's a lot happening. But there's a big disconnect between that and what we're talking about. And then we came to the last presentation of the conference. And it was a presentation by a guy called Nick Cleary, I'm going to out him, from an organisation called the Consolidated Land and Environment. I can't remember what A stands for, but it's Clara. And he very excitedly presented a plan as to how our population is going to increase exponentially by 2050, and we've got too much urban sprawl, and the way to deal with that is to build 7 large regional cities around Sydney and Melbourne, so between Sydney and Canberra and Melbourne and Shepparton, from scratch. And the way they were going to do that, not with public money, but with private companies moving in that they're attracting from overseas to build these cities from scratch around the company. So pretty much the checklist of everything we should not be doing, we ticked every box and more. It's top down, it's new resources. They were going to build it in areas that are currently in drought. Didn't mention climate change, it was all about growth. Now, I would have written it off. I would have gone, this is crazy, like, you know, who's serious about this? But he managed to get $16 million of federal funding just to develop the idea over 6 months. And they've bought some land already. And they've got companies signed up. And I started to get angry. I'm sitting in the front seat, I'm getting angrier and angrier, going, how is this possible that we're talking about this? And I was dumbfounded because we just spent 2 days talking about how many regional cities are actually stressed because they've been built on industries that are dying and they don't have replacement industries. They have a workforce, they have the infrastructure, but what's going to happen? So, okay, he's very enthusiastic about it. So what's going to happen to those cities? And then places like Geelong, that's not far from Melbourne. The other reason I was dumbfounded was because there are 2 wonderful people in this audience, and I want you to indicate who you are. So Nilmani De Silva, oh my God, and Stephen Liaris, yep. And they've got a plan to build a human settlement of 200 households, but to do it within ecological limits, to do it on circular economy principles, and they're 10 planners, they know what they're talking about. They've got a really solid plan. Their plan costs about the same as this guy got to do his business case. So the irony of sitting in that room with such different visions for how things could be, just I was like, how do I bridge this? So it took me about 2 weeks. I was pretty upset about it. I was like, because this isn't the only time I'm hearing these kinds of plans. The Northern Australia development stuff is along the same lines. We're talking 1950s growth-oriented development plans, and they're getting a lot of political support. So what do we do about it? And I think it's already been touched on. I think this is our role, is in every situation we're in. How do we get to a place where we're educated enough and we have a language that when these openings for discussion come up, we're actually ready to respond? How do we build our toolkits? And I'm not just talking about if you're a steady state person, that's your toolkit, or if you're a cooperative person, that's your toolkit. How do we actually get across all the different sorts of options that we have, practical and ideas, that when we're in that situation, our particular thing might not be the right thing, but we can put forward lots of different alternatives to actually get things going. Because what I've found in the work that I do at all local levels of government and even in corporations, there are people like us that are questioning the system. They don't know what to do. So how can we be ready to respond going, okay, if your goal is this, it's about housing or settlements, that's one way of doing it. What are the other ways of doing it to move forward? So there's actually choice and diversity in how we do this. Because that creates a space for creativity and dialogue. How do we develop the political skills that we're actually able to engage at all levels? Because we need to get involved. It's not just about building things, it's actually about how do we build things and then actually work out where the openings are to engage in the political processes. Do we actually put into submissions when there's a new development plan? Do we actually go and talk to our MPs about this? Do we actually try and find people within the bigger structures who are making decisions about where resources go? And are we helping them to design things better? Doesn't necessarily mean we go from here to 100%. Where are the openings to actually change what's already happening? How do we question the people in power? So yes, some of this is about opposition. Some of it's saying enough, this is no. But some of it's also getting involved in these processes and trying to strategize around how we move forward. Underneath that though is the work, and this is what I was struggling with in the room, is how how do we get to a place where we can ask a question that exposes the faulty assumptions underneath all of these plans? And I did at the time, very kind of roughly, but I asked the questions of him, and it wasn't about him, it was the rest of the audience. How have you factored in climate change into your population projections? Why are you planning this for areas that are in drought right now? What about these regional cities that are actually struggling? Can't we just retrofit them instead of using new resources? And what's in it for these private companies? I'm just really interested as to how they're going to get their money back. Now, it wasn't going to change his mind, but it shifted the audience from suddenly people getting excited about this new big idea to suddenly going, oh, just a minute, is this what we're really aiming for? Yep. So these are the questions I want you to have in your mind as you go forward. When you hit with stuff like this, it's asking, what's the outcome that we're trying to produce? Is there another way of doing it? Who is benefiting from this? How can we share the benefits more broadly? What sort of community is this building? And is there a way that we can actually regenerate the natural environment, not just reduce environmental impacts? Who's deciding, and how can we open up the processes for more political engagement of more people? How can we do it differently? If we have that checklist, and we can use that, take it with us wherever we go, we can start to build the sort of politics that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, NENA. Thank you so much for that. Our fourth and final panellist for this morning is Dr. Stephen Healy, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society of Western Sydney University. His current ARC-funded research project focuses on the future of manufacturing in Australia. Stephen's co-author of Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming our communities, and a founding member of the Community Economies Collective, and associate editor of the Diverse Economies Livable World book series from University of Minnesota Press. Please join me in welcoming Stephen.
Morning, everybody. Thanks very much, Darren, and other members of the organizing committee for the third NENA conference. I've been to all three. They're fantastic. It's like coming home each time. And thanks to the previous speaker on the Post-Capitalism session and to my fellow panelists, I feel like my thunder has been totally stolen. I'm not sure what I had. I just have to remember reinforcement, not repetition. So, and apologies in advance, I've written my remarks out just for the sake of time. Some reflections on post-capitalism. So it seems to me that right now post-capitalism is becoming more discernible to a great many people in just the past few years. In contrast, it was lonely work for my comrade colleagues J.K. Gibson Graham when they published Post-Capitalist Politics in 2006, or for that matter, The End of Capitalism in 1996, when the idea was crazy, almost inconceivable. It was a different time back then, 2 years before the global financial crisis and 12 years away from the scientific consensus that that much warmer, meaner world that we've been worrying about is set to arrive soon, within our lifetime, and perhaps already. So there seems to be a widening discussion about what post-capitalism is, but also a multiplication about what it might mean. So just to give a couple of examples, there's an optimistic and technophilic vision articulated by people like William Schreinick and Alex William in their book, Inventing the Future. So they see in the emergence of new forms of automation, that combination of artificial intelligence and platform technology, a chance for many of us to be liberated from the need to work and a rationale for redistribution via a universal basic income scheme. Their vision of a post-capitalist future is described as fully automated luxury communism. In contrast to this, others like William Streeck, and he's just an example, offer a far more pessimistic view. In his analysis, global capitalism has already reached the limits of economic growth. In fact, he describes it as a bloated corpse. For Streeck, sluggish global growth, even in the context of an economic recovery, means that there's little chance for integrating the bottom billions into the formal market economy. He doesn't see a chance for further industrial expansion because markets are already oversupplied. And in the context of aging societies with falling labor force participation rates, he sees a sort of similar stagnation as an untranscendable condition. So Streeck argues that attempts in the US and many other countries to manage these contradictions will further exacerbate inequality. So for example, lowering corporate tax rates to encourage growth will result in either permanent austerity, rising levels of public debt, or some combination of the two. Republicans have already declared in my country that if they win the midterms, they're coming after what's left of our social entitlements because the tax cuts haven't paid for themselves. And as we've learned, austerity in this context then becomes the perfect moment for a populist politics of reaction. And in the context of societies like the US, that's the kind of, that takes the shape of an unabashed form of white supremacism, an attempt at holding on to privilege. And just parenthetically, that idea of the politics as a commons, I think that's an incredibly powerful and important concept. And for me, I feel like hospitality has become an almost unutterable term in my society. The idea that we can be welcoming to the stranger is, in fact, a commons that we make and share through the feelings that we have for one another. And when that becomes, when you can't feel that anymore, and when you're afraid of your neighbor, when you're locked into that mentality of survivalism that Mary Graham put so well yesterday, then watch out. And I thought I was safe from it over here on the other side of the planet, and then last week happened, and I learned that half of you senators voted for it's okay to be white. Not sure what to make of that clerical error. Okay, so two visions of post-capitalism. One that seems to be too good to be true, and another that actually twists the Frederick Jameson quote already mentioned, right? It's no longer that we can't imagine the end of capitalism or the end of the world. It's that actually the two seem to become increasingly indistinguishable from one another. And so what's interesting to me is that both these visions, the optimistic and the pessimistic, continue to displace post-capitalism into a familiar temporality. The not quite yet, we're not there yet. Post-capitalism remains something that we're either anticipating with optimism or with dread, but it still positions us, progressives on the left, whatever you want to call us, in that position of waiting for the revolution. And it's here that I think we might see a contrast with J.K. Gibson Graham's earlier vision of post-capitalism, really something that they've been developing since they asked the question in the 1990s, why is it that feminists can have their revolution now while we, Marxists, have to wait? Their starting point was an anti-essentialist Marxian theory, which points to the way in which capitalism has always been crisis-prone, contradictory, and incoherent, in a sense, not a system, and that we've always lived in a more than capitalist world, that alongside enterprises engaging wage labor, there's always been a more than capitalist economy, other forms of organization, exchange, mechanisms of investment, forms of ownership, and ways for caring for what's held in common. And I don't need to push this point, we're demonstrating it by being here. I've heard countless examples yesterday and over the last two conferences of how the post-capitalism we want means enlarging what's already presently discernible in the economic landscape. So this vision of the post-capitalist present is sustained by insights from feminist economics, queer, and decolonial theory. And Julian Kaff's work has gone on to inspire a whole group of activist scholars, the Community Economies Research Network, that's now global in scale and has more than 200 members, and all of them are engaged in trying to identify the kinds of things that are being described in this context, to represent them through new systems of valuation beyond GDP, through artistic expression, through certainly academic articles, through teaching, and that becomes the basis for sharing. And for me, it becomes a way, I think, of kind of place-based production of a post-capitalist present that can then become international in scope through sharing, a kind of place-based internationalism, which seems like a contradiction in terms, but it's really, I mean, Bowen's concept of cosmolocalism, same idea. I am just sort of adding my voice to the chorus of echoes. But I just want to end by re-asking the question that I think was implicit in Amanda's analysis, which is, all right, it's great that we're talking to one another. What I want to understand is, how do we talk to people who are sort of pushed into that survivalist position because they're afraid, and therefore they're either vulnerable to or complicit to those right-wing versions of communitarianism that seem to be steadily taking over the political landscape in my country, and not to mention the United Kingdom, Turkey, India, well, the long list of places, much of Scandinavia, so on and so forth. So I think we're at a kind of pretty important point here, and I'm out of time. Didn't plan to do that. So.
look, thank you so much.